The reality we live in can be a very strange place. Most of the time, fact being stranger than fiction. How will we ever start to understand this reality we live in unless we question everything? Join me and a guest as we unravel the mysteries of this reality, one topic at a time. This is Inquiries of Our Reality with Shayn Jones.
What is up, Inquirers, and welcome to the expanse of deep open-minded conversation. I'm the one they call Shane, and today for you guys, I have an author who definitely has a fascinating connection to the paranormal, and in turn, brings it into the fold as far as her story writing goes. And as they say, you definitely tend to write what you know, and this person definitely knows some of the inner workings, and in turn, she ends up sharing some of her own experiences that she's used for influence in her books. But before we get into this fascinating conversation today, just a quick update. For those of you who enjoy shopping on Etsy, I have now integrated my merch store into my Etsy store. So now the Bizarrities Etsy store is now the Open Minds Media store. And it features Bizarrities, of course, but you can also pick up merch there. So now you can pick up, some awesome tea, and you can pick up some cryptid merch and get it all in one place. And I've actually switched over the actual Open Minds Media merch store to Printify, so it's no longer on Teespring. Better quality t-shirts, and a lot better layout as far as setting up the store and being able to design and stuff like that on it. So, and with the new merch store, of course, I also dropped a brand new design. It's one I've been wanting to drop for a while, but I was having some issues with Teespring as far as dropping it. But it's inspired by Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, and this is Squatch country, and it has a rendering of Sasquatch, of course, as Hunter S. Thompson, and Mothman as Dr. Gonzo. And I really enjoy the design. I think you guys might enjoy it too, but don't forget to go and check it out. If you haven't already seen it on the Instagram, of course, it should be the one at the top of the page on most of the stores. And just a quick message, this podcast has a strong focus on community engagement, so I encourage all listeners to share their own experiences and research on the show. That said, if you guys have an encounter or an experience you would like to share on the show or have me investigate, please email me at ommencounterreports@outlook.com, or you guys can call the OMM Encounter Reports hotline, which is 313-364-1551. And if you call into that one, you can either leave a voicemail or you can text it. And depending on what you want to do with your experience, please let me know what you would like to do with it. If you want to share it on the show, or if you want to keep it completely between us and not have it shared on the show whatsoever and have me possibly investigate it or just have somebody to talk to about it. I'm always here for all that kind of stuff. Just let me know what you guys are intending to do with your experience, of course. And if anybody would like to be a guest on the show, you guys can email me at inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com. And if you enjoy the show and you think I deserve it, please leave a review or rating for the show on iTunes or Spotify. Your guys' continued support makes the show possible, and your opinions go a long way to help the show grow and improve. So I thank you guys, and I appreciate you guys for supporting the show. And every single thing that I mention is all available on the link tree, which is available down in the show description. And with that, let's get into the show. Please welcome to the show, author and podcaster, J.B. Caine. How's it going today?
It is going so great. How are you?
Not doing too bad. Glad to have you on the show. I heard that we kind of got connected through a mutual friend who had been on the previous guest on the show. So I always love when I get to reconnect with people through previous guests, because it always ends up leading into great conversations.
Yes, I am very good friends with one Betsy Kulikowski, who you have, I think, spoken with several times. And she said you are just a delight. And so when you guys indicated that you were interested in looking for guests, she definitely green-lighted you and said, yes, absolutely, go talk to Shane. And I was like, cool. So here I am.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. At least I'm building up a good repertoire with my previous guests that they end up passing people on, because once somebody leaves the show, sometimes we don't end up talking too much after. I'm always kind of curious what their opinion was beyond the show. So it's always nice to hear that somebody had a good experience and pass it on to somebody else to come on.
Yes, no warning labels were assigned. You're good.
So I guess this will kind of lead a little bit into Betsy too, and how you guys know each other and are familiar with each other. But for anybody that may not be familiar with who you are, what you do, why don't you let them know a little bit about yourself and a little bit about what you do?
Okay, I would be happy to do that. So I am an author primarily. I write paranormal, horror, fantasy. If there's magic in it, I'm all about that life. So that is
You and me
my
both.
primary area. And I also co-podcast the Unfreaking Believable podcast with Betsy Kulikowski and Jenny LeBranch. And we kind of met through the Instagram writing community and through WriterCon, which occurs in Oklahoma City every September. And that's sort of how we all crossed paths. And now we are just a wicked little three group of women, our own little kind of shenanigan laden coven, if you will. So, and so, yeah, I love writing things that tickle the imagination, and just like Betsy and Jenny do. So we were a perfect fit from the start.
So I guess a good spot to start, because I definitely want to dive into all your books, and I'm sure that's probably going to be the bulk of the conversation. But at least as far as the podcast goes, considering that all of you guys are writers, what exactly do you guys cover on your podcast, or what would people expect if they went and checked out your podcast?
Well, we actually have guests on that come and tell us about sort of inciting incidents in their lives that ended up being sort of moments of transition or moments that changed the trajectory of their lives. And sometimes those moments are miracles, supernatural encounters, dumb luck, moments of courage. It could be anything. But the idea is that life, as you often say as well, is stranger than fiction. So we like to kind of look at those moments and ask people, and we've talked to authors, we've talked to film directors, actors, just ordinary folks, other podcasters. We ask them, what is this moment that kind of changed the way that you saw either some segment of the world or maybe even the way your life was going, and sort of had a lasting effect on you. And that's sort of the crux of our show, is just those inciting incidents, and just talking to interesting people who have interesting stories to share.
Just as considering you guys are writers too, have you guys noticed that it's kind of given you guys some inspiration for your writing, where, some people's stories and stuff, you might kind of use some details possibly to help with some character development in your guys' own stories?
I don't know so much about that. For me personally, I can't speak for Betsy or Jenny, but I can tell you that the people that we have interacted with from all different walks of industry and different creative pursuits and whatnot has basically just gotten us to where it really motivates us to use our voices to tell our stories. And it just reminds us more than anything else that there really is a supportive creative community out there. And I think that when you are an author and even a podcaster, you kind of sometimes feel like it's hard to find that community. It's very hard to kind of get out there and market yourself. A lot of authors are introverts and they don't like to kind of put themselves out there. And it has really allowed us to feel much more comfortable in that space, and also just meet some amazing people who have inspired us to look at the world in a slightly different way. So I don't think it's directly influenced any of the writing I've had so far, although I should say that could happen. I don't rule it out. We did have one person who I've worked with extensively on creative endeavors, so it's quite possible that may happen.
One really good paranormal story, and it might end up being like a main focus for a story or something like that. But
it could be, or it could be just, it might sort of inspire several steps removed from that. So we've had people on there that have talked about ghost encounters, and I write a lot of paranormal, so I write about a lot of ghost encounters. And so something they say might spark an idea that's connected to some element of folklore, because I'm a big lover of folklore. And then I might go down the internet rabbit hole researching that bit of folklore. So maybe not directly, but certainly indirectly, I would say that's fair.
Oh yeah, definitely indirectly on that. Because I mean, all it takes is you hear about a good enough story, and even if you don't take their full encounter, you maybe take the creature that they'd seen, and maybe you kind of use it as some inspiration for, like, if a character in your book or something encounters something like this, like how people would naturally react to some stuff. I mean, at least at the minimum, it'll kind of help you with knowing, like, general people's, like, responses to, like, certain things. So it kind of help you to fluctuate your story to be a little bit more down to earth as far as, like, what the average person would do in these types of situations.
Right. And I was a teacher for 30 years, and I have used former students of mine as character inspiration. But if I have done that, I have talked to them about it first to make sure that they were okay with showing up in a book. Usually I ask them if they want to be a hero or a villain, and if they want to get killed off or not. I usually ask them those questions. But I have actually had some really great, they're no longer students. All of these folks are now well into their 20s, and some are even really close to their 30s. And some really good friendships have come out of that as well. And some of them have even gone into creative careers of their own. And so we've kind of created more of that community in that cycle. But yes, there are quite a few former students of mine who are characters in my books.
Creating a loop of inspiration, because one inspires the other, and it's this continuous thing of momentum. And I mean, with writers too, it seems like once you get going, you get going. But once if you don't have that inspiration, it's kind of hard to do stuff. And I feel like that's where a lot of people drop off. I mean, with podcasting, with any type of creativity, like, people end up dropping off if they don't feel like they have a good enough idea, or if they don't have that community of people that are, like, pushing them to continuously be inspired. Because otherwise, at a certain point, if you're not inspired, it starts not so much feeling like a passion, but more like a job or like work. And at that point, it's kind of like hard to come back once you start going too far down that.
Absolutely. Yeah. Middles are hard. Middles of books are hard.
Trying to keep that story going, especially trying to get to that end point that you want to get to. Or if you don't even know what end point you want to get to, you're just kind of writing the story as it comes to you, then it's kind of like, it's harder almost, I feel, if you don't kind of have, like, your end idea about how you want it to kind of finish up. But I always hear about, with a lot of writers, it's like, I don't know how to end it. Like, I've written everything. I'm at the end. Like, how do I finish this?
Right. And, there's different people who write in different ways. There are people who plan. There are people who fly by the seat of their pants, planners and pantsers for those author people out there. They know that term. I'm in between. I write an outline, and then I don't mind deviating from that outline if the characters decide the story's going to do something different, which they sometimes do. So,
see, I got to kind of plan stuff out at least. Like, I have some endeavors that I kind of have in the works. I have one person for a while ago that I was talking about getting a comic book started up with and stuff, but it's like, I kind of have to plan stuff out. Like, I need to have, like, my end first, and then I kind of work back from there. And at least that's kind of like how my creative process comes for things, is I got to, like, have that end, what I want in focus, and then I got to build up the pieces to get to that point. Even with, like, anything, doing art, doing podcasts, it's like, that's kind of how I view things creatively, is the finished product, and then build up to that.
Prefer having at least some element of a plan myself. I don't like to kind of just go in and fly blind. Some people love that, and they like to discover the story as it happens, but I'm too much of a control freak for that, I think.
Ironically, it's a back and forth, because these conversations, I keep them pretty, like, off the cuff of my pants, like, just kind of let them ride off, but everything else is pre-planned. It's just the show itself. It's like, I'm better at that ad lib, let's just kind of keep rolling with it and see where it ends up kind of thing. So it's funny how it's like, you kind of bring in multiple facets into everybody. I feel like it's, with certain things you do it one way, with certain things you do it the other way. It kind of depends on how your brain works. But I don't feel like anybody's solid one way. Yeah, that's true. You can't always fix it in post. We will be right back after this brief commercial break. But just a quick reminder, if you guys want to stay up to date on the show, you guys can always go and follow Inquiries of Our Reality and Open Minds Media on Instagram, Facebook, Discord, YouTube, and TikTok. Now, feel free to fast forward through these commercials so we can hop right back into the show. And we are back, so let's get back to it. So I guess since we're kind of starting to dive into the books a little bit, you mentioned, of course, that you dive into like paranormal horror books. So kind of bringing it back to the beginning, I know some people kind of get inspired by experiences. Some people just kind of get inspired by the topic as a whole. But where did it kind of start for you that you want to start to go down the avenue of writing like horror and paranormal books in particular?
Well, I've always had an incredible passion for folklore ever since I was really, really small. And I think the earliest thing I remember being truly fascinated with was the Loch Ness Monster. I'm a huge fan of cryptids in all forms. I am a Nessie girl through and through. Everybody's kind of got their banner cryptid if you're part of that community, and that's the one I'd wear on a shirt.
Call me generic, but I'm a Sasquatch guy. Like I love all the cryptids, but Sasquatch is mine.
I see your little guy there behind you, and I do love a good Sasquatch story as well. I even have I have a sticker on the back of my car that's a Sasquatch sticker. So I love all cryptids, but that's kind of where it started for me. And then from that, it sort of grew out to a fascination with folklore, myth, that kind of stuff. But not just the stories, but also sort of the realities that became the stories. I like kind of digging into the anthropology of it and figuring out, what were the influences that might have created that, and sort of, really digging deep and thinking about those as well. And then the older I got, you kind of get more serious about things. You get very focused on school and work and all that sort of stuff. But when I was in college, I started studying world religions, and I again, still my love of folklore also made me very fascinated with world religions. And through that, I'd always had certain uncanny intuitions, let me say, that I was very good at knowing if people were lying to me. I was very good at knowing what someone's true intentions were when I was talking to them. And I didn't know the name for it at the time, but I came to learn later that's kind of like being an empath. So I didn't really know what that was called at the time. But when I started studying religions, I became friends with a number of people who were Wiccan. And that was very much outside my sphere of people that I had met. So it was a completely different paradigm of the world, a very different perspective. And I was just really interested in hearing what they had to say about stuff. And all of a sudden, I started learning names for the things that had been happening to me for a lot of my life. Things like empath and clairaudient. And so all of the things that I just kind of wrote off as, oh, well, I guess that's just my creative brain. And yet really weird things would happen connected to those things. All of a sudden, I started to understand what they were. And that's kind of where my interest in the paranormal took a whole different turn, because now I understood what I was hearing, what I was experiencing, whereas before I had just written it off because that's what everyone around me would have done. So when I started to be introduced to people who actually thought of the paranormal as normal, I had a very different view of what was happening. So I came to understand that I was hearing that the things that I was hearing, some of those intuitions that I was hearing, was actually clairaudience. So I was hearing ghosts, hearing spirits. And I had so many things happen that were so weird and so uncanny that all of a sudden I was like, oh, now I understand why. And it all made sense. And that kind of, you get a lot of that influence in my books, particularly in the Arcana trilogy, which is very paranormal oriented. And it's got sort of a tarot as a basis, but it is very, very paranormal in essence. And a lot of the things that are in those books are things that are familiar experiences to me. So,
and at least from you kind of having that ability to hear ghosts, have you as far as your stories go, not necessarily being inspired by it, I guess partially inspired by it, but have you ever had any of those experiences where you've kind of had something almost tell you like, hey, like I want my story written, and you've kind of like brought their story into the fold? Because it seems like a lot of the time when you're dealing with spirits, with ghosts, with apparitions, whatever you want to call them, it seems like more often than not, like their main thing is that they want their story told. So have you ever had that experience where you've had that ability to be able to tell somebody's story that need to be told?
So interestingly, for most of the time when I kind of understood what that was, so let's say 30 years or so, I was not a full-time author at that time. I was a teacher. And so...
Were you writing paranormal books at that time, or did the paranormal stuff start after all of this?
No, I was not really writing so much. I mean, I wrote short stories every now and then, and I was definitely interested. I had a million outlines for stories, but I hadn't completed any novels yet at that point. So, but I still would have very strange paranormal experiences happen. I've had spirits ask me to give messages to students, which, as you might imagine, is extraordinarily awkward. And usually I would, one of the things about knowing people who are Wiccan is they're really good at telling you how to put shields up around your abilities so that you don't have constant noise. And I had learned how to do that. So most of the time at school, I had sort of these shields up so I wasn't constantly hearing the sort of white noise of spirits, being present. And because, as you might imagine, spirits tend to fall around the people they're most concerned about, and quite often those are kids.
Yeah, like, hey, Billy, can you stay after class? And then you sit down with them and you're like, hey, so do you believe in ghosts?
Yeah. So, yeah, well, and you don't want to get into that conversation as a teacher, right? Because then, that's a mess. And unfortunately,
it kind of gets into religion a little bit, which seems definitely is one of those topics you can't really get into with kids.
It's very dangerous territory. And most of the time I was pretty good steering clear of it. There was one case where I was not able to steer clear of it. I was teaching creative writing, and I was talking about different genres, and we started talking about, fantasy, urban fantasy, all that kind of stuff. And without really realizing it, I had let my shields down, and all of a sudden there's this poke, 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 somebody trying to get my attention. And I basically was like, what do you want? I had to kind of step outside because it was definitely somebody was trying to communicate with me to try to get me to give this one particular student of mine named Jessica a message. And so I stepped outside for a minute, and I just kind of listened to what he had to say. And I really didn't want to go that way because, you can be accused of all kinds of crazy things. But I did end up pulling her outside because the message did seem fairly important. And so a lot of times a spirit will give you some kind of detail to verify to that person that it is them talking and not just some random, generic piece of information. And so I pulled her outside, and I knew her pretty well. I had taught her for a couple of years, and I said, hey, look, I don't normally do this. And so I just want to apologize. I'm not trying to make you feel uncomfortable, but this seems really important. And do you have a grandfather who has passed? And she just looked at me, and I was like, yeah, well, he's here. And she's sort of looking at, all my kids knew I was a little crazy. So it was probably not as big a leap as, if suddenly I'd grown a second head or something, but, she said, yeah. And I said, okay, so he's here and he's showing me a clock or a watch. And he says, this is how you'll know it's him. Well, she had inherited a watch from her grandfather. And so she's sitting there and she's kind of like looking at him, her eyes are as big as dinner plates. And I was like, look, he just wants you to know that everything's going to be okay and that you can't control what your mom is doing, and it's not your responsibility. I don't know what he's talking about, but he says it's really important that you understand that. And she just started crying. And basically, her grandfather had died of lung cancer, as I recall it, and her mother was smoking a lot, and she was very worried about it. She was trying to get her mom to stop smoking. Now, I didn't know that at the time, but when I told her that, then she told me, this is what that means. And I said, look, this message was for you so that you know this is not your responsibility. This is not your job to fix. So, you know, I'm not encouraging you to keep a secret from your mom or anything, but that message was for you. And I don't know how your mom would take it, but, you know, just letting you know, and that everything's okay. And then she kind of gathered herself, and then she was all right. Sure enough, she did go home and tell her mom about it, and her mom decided I was a Satanist.
See, that's the other part that doesn't make sense to me about a lot of that stuff, is because it's like, if you really look into stuff, you know, we like to demonize a lot of these different abilities, but they're scattered throughout the Bible that people had these abilities and they were viewed as prophets. Like,
right.
I don't understand where that division comes in. Like, if you're doing something bad, then that's one thing. But if you're bringing loving messages from people and you're not doing it with trying to summon these people, these things are coming to you and giving you these things. Like, people kind of have to look at it in a different light, you know? Like, I'm not saying that anybody has these abilities or like a prophet or anything like that, but, you know, there's a lot of mysticism in the Bible that gets overlooked, especially nowadays, where people just kind of throw all this stuff out. But if you go into the early days of the Bible, talking about like Old Testament stuff, it's very, there's a lot of very mythical, or not mythical, but mystical type ideology within it.
Absolutely. And funnily enough, 20 years later, I heard from this student through Facebook, of all things, and her mom had come around, and her mom wanted to see if I could, you know, try to contact her dad, who had passed away by that time. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to do that because it doesn't really work that way. But without, you know, all kinds of trappings that I don't really get into. I didn't want to, you know, do a seance or any of that kind of stuff, but, you know, but her mom had come around. So I don't know if that opened her mind up a little bit.
She may have felt defensive at first because it was directed right at her. I mean, that may have definitely been something too, because I'm sure that when anybody gets caught doing something they're not supposed to do, like, they first try to pass the blame, then they kind of go, oh, it was me. I'm sorry.
Well, and I think, too, the fact that I literally never followed it up with anything else. I mean, I was definitely not trying to persuade the girl to do anything. I wasn't trying to be weird about it. It wasn't, you know, it was never like me trying to groom this child or anything.
In any context, telling somebody to stop smoking cigarettes, I don't feel is a bad thing. Like, in any context, you know.
But I mean, I had never met her mother, so I could see why the mom would be weirded out by it. And that's the whole reason why I usually kept my shields up at school, because I don't want to have to deal with all that kind of stuff. So. But anyway, it all worked out fine. But I guess my point is, I've had so many experiences like that. Usually not at school, but then even once I started writing, you know, full novels and completing stories instead of just writing ideas down, a lot of those experiences, in one way or another, found their way into my stories. So that really gave me, I think, a unique perspective for other people who have this similar abilities. If they read the way it unfolds in one of my Arcana books, they go, "Yep, that's how it works. That's what happens." And I have had people tell me that, yes, that is exactly how that works. And it probably doesn't work the same way for everybody, but you know, I think that having those abilities has given me the ability to write about paranormal, A, better, and B, with a great respect for it, as opposed to Hollywoodizing it too much.
Yeah, I was going to say, you write what you know. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's like, if you're familiar with paranormal as a whole, those are people end up being the best writers for that kind of stuff. It's kind of like the same concept that, you know, people that are really good sci-fi writers, they're usually really, really good with like philosophy and with like theology and stuff like that. And they kind of bring it all into the fold and connect it. Like, you got to write what you're familiar with. Otherwise, you're going to be in over your head. And even on the other side, it's kind of hard to finish a project when you don't feel comfortable doing something that you're doing. You want to get to that flow state where it's like, it's challenging, but it's not too challenging to the point where you're going to give up on it. And if you're writing something you don't know, a lot of great writers, you know, will end up not continuing to write just because they weren't writing the correct thing that they should have been writing that would have pushed them into that good direction.
Right. And, I support dabbling in anything that calls to you as a creative person, but you're right. It becomes more frustrating when it's more foreign to you. And some people love that challenge, but I think that the authenticity of your voice comes out a lot better when it's something that you understand on a more molecular level,
Yeah, exactly. Hold that thought. We'll be right back. But before we get into this commercial break, if you hate ads, well, you can get ad-free and early access on Patreon for just $1 a month. And it's a great way to support the show. And if you'd like some extra video content and merch store discounts, there are a few other tiers with additional benefits with 7-day free trials available for most. Now let's get to the commercial break so we can hop back in the show. And we are back. So let's hop right in. And kind of diving some more into the paranormal stuff. You mentioned that story that, about the student at school, but you would also mention that you've had more experiences like outside of that where you can kind of connect with it a little bit more. I'd love to hear about some of those experiences you've had and how they've kind of connected into your books.
Yeah, so there have been so many. I have had a couple of experiences with shadow people, which I'm not overwhelmingly fond of. But there some limited shadow people kinds of things might pop into my books, and that has allowed me to describe the feeling, the heaviness, the sort of even for somebody who's kind of used to hearing spirits, I don't normally see them. It's been very rare that I physically see something like with my eyes as opposed to my intuition. And so to physically see a shadow person is it's a very frightening thing if that's outside your experience. Now I have talked to people who they are clairvoyant as opposed to clairaudient. So they see things as opposed to hearing things. And for them, it's probably not as weird. But for me, it was very unnerving and uncomfortable. So that allowed me to, I think, write about that. I've also had experiences with energy manipulation and being able to visualize and manifest certain effects. And so those kinds of things have come across in the books. But I've definitely had a lot of shares of ghost stories. I had a poltergeist experience in Scotland, which some version of that has wheedled its way into the Arcana series.
Was it like you just kind of had an interaction with somebody there, or were you like living there and you dealt with like a full poltergeist experience?
It was, so I was actually on a ghost tour of all things, which if you've ever been on a ghost tour, you know that the least likely place you are to have a paranormal experience is on a ghost tour. But this particular ghost tour was in Edinburgh and went underground because Edinburgh is built on top of old Edinburgh, much of which burned down at some point. And so there's actually an old city underneath the city that you see on the surface. And the tour was actually underneath the city. And so in the old parts of the city. And I'd been on many ghost tours and never had a single paranormal experience. And as somebody who is a believer, I am also naturally a skeptic because I think 90% of what people experience as paranormal is probably not.
This is a reoccurring concept on my show that I always say, if you want to do the research you have to be a skeptic just as much as open-minded, because otherwise every bump in the night is a ghost or a Sasquatch. Like,
Correct.
You have to evaluate getting everything out that it could be that's real world, and once you have something unquestionable, then you know you got something to research.
Absolutely. And that's always how I go into those things. So when I go and I might have an oogie feeling or something like that going someplace, yes, maybe it is my intuition telling me that something is present or weird or whatever. But also maybe it's just that my mind is in a place where I'm open to that feeling, and so I feel that feeling. So I'm very much aware of those kinds of things when I go on ghost tours. But in this particular case, they started by walking us through this building where someone had committed suicide, and not even a blip on my spirit radar at all in this. I mean, it wasn't a pleasant feeling room. I've found that rooms where tragedies have occurred just don't feel good, even if there's nothing particularly haunted about it. But
there's just a dark energy to the room in general, and especially like you mentioned, being an empath too, you pick up on any differentiation within like the energy fields of each particular room, you know?
Well, and a lot of ghost research will tell you that some of those things, you know, it's almost like recorded in stones, right? Like the stones can absorb some of that, and certain types of stones can absorb a lot of that energy, and you know, things like limestone that are relatively porous.
It's the stone tape theory, where it almost is essentially viewing like it works like a VHS tape, that it's magnetic and something attaches itself to it. It functions basically the same way a VHS tape would function.
Right. And so that's the kind of vibes that I got from that room. But then when we went down below, I was like, okay, this feels different. And instead of just kind of an oogie feeling, I was having not physical visions, but I was having internal visions of specific things happening in different parts of the areas where we were. And I was with it was on a student tour, actually. I'd taken a bunch of students with me, and there was another teacher there. And I said, look, I'm going to describe to you everything that I'm getting here, the feelings that I'm getting, the impressions that I'm getting. And, you know, I'm just going to take a note of them. And I want to see if anybody else got any of that stuff when we come out. And almost everything that I got was residual. So I had an image there was sort of this long hallway with 4 rooms. And at one end, there was a small staircase that led to like an exit that would take you, I think, back out onto the street. And I had an image of a child dressed in, you know, not great clothing, definitely a poor child, shivering, being cold. And it was definitely residual. There was nothing intelligent about this haunting. I just had an impression of it, and it was incredibly powerful. And that's not something that happens to me all that often at that level of strength. And then there was another room that I had an image of a woman in sort of Edwardian looking clothes, carrying like bolts of fabric in and out of this room. And I knew she was incredibly sad because she had a child die. But she had to go back to work because she had to eat. And so she had this depression, but she was working and carrying these bolts of fabric in and out of this room. Well, I told the other teacher everything that I was seeing there. And as the tour guide was talking, a couple minutes later, we come to that room where I saw the woman with the fabric. And it turns out that particular room had been part of a textile mill.
Those weird little confirmations that sometimes you question yourself, and you get those and you're just like, wow, there really is something there.
Yeah. So I was kind of low key freaking out. And so she was saying, you know, that, you know, fabrics and things were stored in this room, blah, blah. And I'm just looking at the other lady just with my eyeballs, you know, like Marty Feldman out of my head. And then we came to another room, and they said, we don't allow people to go in this room because a lot of people have become really ill going in this room, so we don't go in this room. So they skipped that room. I definitely felt very icky about that room even before they said that, so I was glad they didn't want to go in there.
Did you get to look in there by chance, and did you happen to get any of those visions or anything from that room?
I didn't see anything, but I definitely got a strong stay away vibe, and this is why I will live till the end of a horror movie, is because if I get a strong stay away vibe, I'm out. I'm like that, not going in there to investigate if I get that strong of a feeling. So
you hear a bump in the night, you barricade yourself up instead of going, what's that sound? Let's go check it out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, something along those lines. Yeah. So if I had a very strong impression not to go near that room, I was going to listen to my gut, especially given what had already happened and knowing that my senses were firing on all cylinders in this place. So then we got down to what was the final room of this hallway, and it was this long, sort of narrow room. And the minute I walked in there, I was like, oh, this isn't good. Like, I knew something was wrong in this room. And there were, I'd say, probably 30 of us on the tour, kind of all crammed on one side. And they said, okay, so this room has seen some poltergeist activity. So they separated the men from the women, because they said, you know, this the poltergeist that's in here tends to act up more if we don't keep the men and women separated for some reason. Well, I was on this, as I was standing there about, I'd say maybe 8 yards away was the other end of the room. And one of the students that was on the tour with me, Caitlin, was standing at the other end. And I had the most incredible urge. I have to protect Caitlin. I just felt incredibly strong. So I kind of wound my way down to that end of the room. And as I'm kind of making my way down there, and again, there's lots of people in my way, so I'm trying not to shove people as I'm moving down there. And I see Caitlin kind of swatting at her hair, and she's pale. I mean, pale. And she's like swatting and twitching a little bit. And I get down there and I just stand next to her. And this is one of the things I was saying about energy manipulation that I had learned from some of the pagans that I had met, is that to create like a field of protective energy around someone, you just kind of imagine a sphere of white light around that person that is impenetrable to darkness. And so I stood very close to her and I just imagined almost like this eggshell around her, just protecting her from whatever's, and instantly she stopped twitching. And she's breathing. And then all of a sudden I felt something on my neck, like it hurt. And I was like, okay, that wasn't good. And then they did some kind of thing on the tour where they clapped really loud to, quote, dispel the energy, but really it's just to give everybody a good jump scare. And then they kind of dismissed us out of the room. And as we're leaving, they said, if you saw anything or experienced anything on the tour, please stop by. We have kind of a register that we keep of what people have seen because we want to see if there's a pattern. Well, the child I had seen in the beginning of the tour has been seen by many, 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 many people. So this was not something that was unrecorded. The woman also had been seen by many, many, many people. And then I also had another image in that room where we were, the poltergeist room, of a dog rooting through debris, rubble, looking for food, like the dog was starving. And we had discovered that room had poor people would go down there to stay warm in the winter, and they would have these barrel fires, and that a huge number of people actually burned to death down there in that room. So I don't know if the dog was connected to that somehow, but nobody had seen the dog other than me. So when we went back to the hotel, of course, this is the one night of the entire tour that I was in a room by myself in the basement of the hotel. Yeah. So I was getting ready for bed and I was thinking to myself, I'm not going to get a lot of sleep. The sun rises at 3:30 in the summer in Scotland. So
3:30. Wow.
Yeah. I was not going to get a lot of sleep that night. So I'm brushing my hair and getting ready to go to bed. And all of a sudden I brush my hair backwards and I see these little scratches on my neck. It looked like the size of a doll's hand, claw marked down the side of my neck where I had felt that pain earlier. I dropped the brush, ran up to where everybody else's rooms were, and I'm like, "You see this, right?" And so that was my poltergeist story, and so elements of that have wound their way into the books. Not the exact story, but elements of it.
We will be right back after this brief commercial break, so stay tuned. But don't forget to check out Bizarre Tees, creature-inspired tees made by yours truly, available for order on the Open Minds Media Etsy store, or join the Bizarre Tees Tea Club on Patreon to receive a monthly tea subscription and samples of new blends, along with full access to the Open Minds Media Patreon. And we are back with the high strangeness. Let's get back into it. Just out of curiosity, too, did you happen to look at your neck before you left the place? Was it there not the whole time, but right after the scratch, or was it something that ended up popping up later? Because it seems like sometimes with the paranormal, stuff will pop up later.
Yeah, I don't know. I know that it hurt at the time. I felt it at the time. But I didn't think to check. I had really long hair at the time. So I didn't think about it. I was mostly like, oh, okay, we finished the tour, and I just was kind of went on my way. So I didn't see the scratches until much later. I don't know when they actually appeared. They may have appeared at that time. I didn't think to check. because I had not, that was the first experience I had had that was like that with a poltergeist. I had kind of been places where supposedly there's poltergeist activity, but I had never had anything directly happen to me until that moment. So that was kind of a weird one. I was just glad I didn't take home a rider.
Yeah, right.
Because I don't think I would have wanted to bring that one home.
Yeah, no, especially not all the way from Scotland, because that'd be a really determined spirit at that point.
Yeah, no, that would be very unpleasant. So, I was worried about that actually, and as you might expect, I did not get a lot of sleep that night.
No.
I slept on the bus the next day on the way to, you guessed it, Loch Ness. So,
I was gonna say, if you went to Scotland, I was hoping you ended up going to Loch Ness too.
I did. I've been there several times actually. I have not yet met Nessie. I'm sorry to say. I probably should have set up an appointment in advance, but I have been there several times, and I fully intend to go back at some point.
So I got to bring it up now that you brought up Nessie. I've never been to Scotland. Probably will never have the chance to. Maybe one day, but I'm assuming probably not anytime soon. But considering, I'm really into the cryptid stuff, when you go to Loch Ness, is it as prevalent as like what people make it out to be, or is it kind of one of those things that it's only like certain groups of people talk about it? And also kind of adding into that too, I know that like we have our stories about Lake Loch Ness, but when you were there, did you pick up any interesting stories you hadn't already heard before about maybe in some encounters with the Loch Ness monster?
Well, as you might imagine, and so the first time I was at Loch Ness, I was 15, so I've been there 3 or 4 times. I want to say it's been 3, but the first time was when I was 15, and we stayed at the Doris Inn, which is on the north end of Loch Ness, and some of the folks that we talked to there claimed that they had seen humps in the water, and I love the stories. It's one of those things where I want to believe it's true. I definitely want to believe that she's out there somewhere. But I also am aware of the science of Loch Ness. And when you go there now, this was less true when I was 15, but when you go there now, it's a huge tourist industry. The entire town of Drumnadrochit there's a huge Loch Ness exhibition center there. Tour buses come through. There are a number of stands sort of around. Every gift shop you go to in Scotland, there's little plushies of the Loch Ness monster.
So it's the sole focus.
Yeah, it is definitely. Well, it's a very, I think it's very beloved as a cultural icon there. I've never gotten anybody who kind of rolls their eyes and go, "Oh yeah, the Loch Ness monster." I think they think of it as sort of their national pet in a way. So it's fondly thought of. But there are also, along with all that, around Loch Ness, people who are extremely serious researchers, both for the science side of it, and working sort of to understand the ecology of Loch Ness. And I'm kind of getting to know some of those people. We had a guest on our show who they did a huge expedition study last summer at Loch Ness. And one of our guests named Ashley actually was part of that expedition. And so she talked to us a little bit about that. And, not everybody thinks that the Loch Ness monster is of alien origin or whatever. Most people who are interested in it just think it's an animal that we don't really understand yet, if they believe that it exists. So all the people that I met that believed in it, and there were some that didn't, I'll admit, but most of them, are more than happy to talk to you about it. And they just think of it as an animal that we don't understand. They don't really necessarily think of it as something magical or of alien origin. I know that the Sasquatch theories can get pretty far afield.
Yeah, there's a spectrum with Sasquatch stuff. You have the straight, it's flesh and blood, it's an ape, and then in the other half that are like, yeah, this thing's walking through portals. Like, I don't know.
Right. And you know what? I love all the stories. Like, whether
it's so proven right, I'll take them all into consideration.
Absolutely. Whatever the truth may be, bring the stories on, because life is a lot more interesting in a world that believes in Nessie and Bigfoot, I think.
Ain't that the truth? And I mean, with Lake Loch Ness too, the hard part to kind of break apart with that is that everybody knows the main photo was staged. Like, there's no doubt in everybody's mind.
Photograph.
Yeah, even like the serious researchers, they all know it was like a little model. It was staged. So I feel like that kind of throws a lot of people off, because all it takes is one fake photo, and then all of a sudden everybody doesn't believe in any part of the phenomenon. But as far as like Nessie goes, you dig into these older stories, and it seems like it had a different. It interacted different than like what the more modern stories are. Like the old stories are, this thing would come up on shore, people would see this thing completely out of the water, like eating sheep,
walking
and then
across the road,
and then taken back off into the water. And then the more modern stories, it's all just people kind of seeing it, in the water. So I mean, whether or not you would believe in it or not, I mean, one theory you kind of have to take into consideration is that there was something there, but then maybe it died off, and now people just want to believe so much that it still is there, but it was there at one point. Or on the other side, as things got more populated, people started getting maybe a little bit more aggressive towards it. Then it chose to stay in the water and maybe look for its particular times to try to ambush prey, because assumably back in the day, like, farmers were chasing this thing off. So it probably got to a point where it was like, I'm going to hunt in the middle of the night, or I'm going to do this in the middle of the night. Or taking into another third theory into consideration, one thing that I've always thought is absolutely fascinating is the whole like salamander theory, the giant salamander theory with Nessie, that maybe there was something in the past and now we're connecting this other thing with it, because, they say that there's supposed to be a giant salamander within each one of these specific places. And the only one doesn't exist that there theoretically should be is near Lake Loch Ness. So, I mean, maybe what people are seeing as the neck could potentially be like the tail of a giant salamander dipping down. But even so, I mean, that's a cryptid all on its own. It's still an undiscovered animal. So it's just as fascinating as Nessie if it ends up being a giant salamander,
Sure. And there are also seals and eels and giant sturgeon and, all those kinds of things that, can contribute to sightings as well. And I think to your earlier point, you have to take all of those into account with any given story. And, the folks who did last year's expedition, they're very serious about, let's see if we can come up with all the natural possible explanations first. They captured some sound stuff on the hydrophone that they can't really explain. There was a woman who took some pictures, some of which they're having a very difficult time debunking. And that was actually before the expedition, but they did meet with her and take a look at her photographs. So there are things that they're at least raising some questions. So again, I choose to keep my mind extremely open to that possibility, because boy, I sure would love it to be true. In fact, I'm actually, the project I was working on actually just before this interview is I am starting a choose your own adventure series for middle grade kids.
Well, I'm glad somebody's bringing that back. I used to love those books.
Yes, right? And it's going to be based entirely on cryptids. So the one that I am writing first is obviously about Loch Ness. And so that's what I've been working on for the month of November.
I'll have to keep tabs on that series when you start producing it. I'll have to make sure I'm the person that buys the first book for each one you release for that.
I will let you know. I'm very excited. It's been a lot of fun to write. Very different voice for me. I'm not used to writing for that young of an audience or in second person, which is really challenging. But it's so much fun to write because there's just no limits. You can make it as weird as you want. And the weirder the ending, the more fun it is. So
yeah, especially with kids and stuff like that too. You don't have to be as descriptive almost to get the point across. You can be a little bit more like basic with your descriptions, but in turn you can be crazier with the story and not lose their attention like you would with adults if you start going too far off the deep end. So it's like give or take a little bit,
Yeah, definitely. So that's been a lot of fun. But I think so my experiences, back to your earlier question, sort of run the gamut of a lot of different things. I've had all different kinds of weird paranormal experiences. Betsy and I, we talked about Betsy. Betsy and Jenny and I had a little writer's retreat in April of this year in the Blue Ridge Mountains, where, you guessed it, Expedition Bigfoot is located.
Yep.
And there we met Amanda, the Bigfoot lady, who has a lovely online presence and she's just a wonderful person. And Betsy and I one morning went hiking. Jenny was sleeping. She was really tired that morning. So Betsy and I went on an early hike, and we did hear some sounds that were surprisingly like the recordings that are attributed to Bigfoot noises. And that did make its way into a story that Betsy and I co-wrote. So we and I know she talked to you about at one point the smell that she experienced near Honubby in Oklahoma. So this was just yet another sort of Bigfoot story. So yes, I absolutely put my experiences into stories for sure.
See, and at least for me too, you brought up Nessie and you brought up Sasquatch. Like, coming from somebody who does a lot of cryptid research, like for me at least, I feel like those ones are probably, well, lake monsters as a whole and Sasquatch, for me at least, I think are the most probable to have the most likeliness to exist, especially like the lake monsters, because it's like, you're trying to scan one side of the lake, depending on how big the lake is, this thing's either on the other side. Like, it's so hard to be able to keep up with this thing, and especially like Lake Loch Ness. I've never been there, like I mentioned, but I've heard from a lot of people that it's not the clearest water in the world. It's pretty dark and dingy.
It's extremely murky.
So it's like if something's sitting still and you're scanning the water on the one side and then, you go to shift over to the other side, like it'd be really, really easy to continuously go around in circles with something and never catch anything, even though it's in there and it's moving with circles around you. And same with a lot of these lake monsters. Like, it's so hard to just take a full scan of an entire lake all at once, know everything that's in there. And if stuff's sitting still, you may not even be picking it up on radar. So, I mean, I feel like lake monsters, again, are probably one of the most probable to exist. And especially with Lake Loch Ness, I'm really hoping that they get somewhere with it. Not to keep bringing up Lake Loch Ness, but just because of, I know how hard that would be over a lot of these other lakes that people are looking for these things in, because, again, it is so murky and dark.
Well, and what are the odds that that a water-based or amphibious creature is going to hang around where the boat motors are? Like,
and who knows if there's caverns underwater too? I mean, you can scan the entire lake, but there might be a little cavern that's over in this other thing that leads out to another underwater cavern, and that thing could live in there, and it only pops into the lake to get food. So it may spend minimal time in the lake, even though that's where you're looking for it.
Hey, look, anything is possible. Anything is possible. And so, I just love the whole speculating process. It's just, it's absolutely the thing that makes the world interesting, is being able to wonder about stuff like that.
Ain't that the truth? Honestly, one of my favorite things to do on the show is create theories about things. And, they might be proven right one day, they might be proven wrong, but it's the fun in the process. And it's also like doing like a mental puzzle to try to figure it out that ends up being the entertaining part of like how this could logically make sense, and bringing it back into like being open-minded and also a skeptic at the same time. Like when I create theories and stuff on paranormal, extraterrestrial, Sasquatch, like anything, it's like I'll start it off with a base of science and then kind of move it into stuff. So, I may throw out some woo-woo claims sometimes, but I'll connect it back in with other things in science or that are already seen in nature somewhere else and kind of bring it full circle. And that's what ends up being fun about it, is just trying to connect unexplainable phenomenon with things that we might possibly already have explained, but we're just not putting two and two together. It takes the right mind sometimes to see the clear answer right in front. Different eyes, different prizes is what I always like to say all the time, because 100 people can look at one particular problem, but it takes that one other person that walks up that wasn't staring at this for a couple hours to walk up and have a new perspective and go, oh, there's the answer. And everybody's like, well, what have we been doing over here?
Well, and I had a conversation, and I don't think this was in our interview. I think this was in a conversation that Ashley and I had later. I'm not real big conspiracy theorist, but I think that there are definitely things out there that are kept secret. And if you were basing a significant economy on whether or not a creature exists, and you found out for sure that it did, and you found evidence, wouldn't it make more sense to keep the mystery going from an economic point of view?
Yeah, because once it's definite, then it becomes just an animal that's within zoology.
It's a giant squid.
Yeah, and then it loses its fascinating part to it. Like if Sasquatch is definitely interesting, but if one day we catch up with this thing, we realize that it's literally just been a giant intelligent ape in the woods, it's still fascinating, but it's going to lose that mystery to it, and it'll just become part of zoology. Right.
And then it'll be a little harder to sell bumper stickers and books and t-shirts and stuff. So
you have to make it cutesy. I mean, some people do that already, but it seems like, if you want to sell stickers or t-shirts with an animal on it, you just got to make it as cute as possible. So that every time people look at it, they're like, that's adorable. I need that.
Yeah. Well, and they love the mystery, right? So it's the mystery that draws people in. Certainty is not nearly as much fun as mystery.
Ain't that the truth?
Yeah.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. And we are back. So let's hop right in. And kind of starting to wrap up towards the end, and I'd love to have you come back on. We can dive into whatever other topic you want to dive into, because it seems like you're pretty vast as far as we got a bunch of different stuff we could talk about. But considering you're an author, you've mentioned your books a few times, I want you to kind of give people a rundown of each of your individual books or series so that people can kind of figure out what they want to dive into and let them know where they can come and find it at.
Sure. Well, all of my stuff can be found on the dreaded Amazon, of course. I have 2 series out at the moment. The Arcana trilogy is the paranormal trilogy that I talked to you about before. It's a tarot-based storyline, very witchy vibes, very young women coming into their power sort of thing. And of course, there is a big bad that must be defeated. The 3 books are connected throughout, but each one has a different main character. And
is that a finished series, or is there still more to come with that one too?
That trilogy is complete. Yes, I finished the last book in August, and I'm extremely happy with the way that it wrapped up. But I love the characters enough that a novella may be coming for a character that didn't get their own book. It's entirely possible. And then I also have the Iron Shield Shadow series, which is more the traditional high fantasy series. Think Dragonlance, Dungeons and Dragons flavors. Very much adventure, cast of misfits on a quest type of thing. And it was written with adults in mind, but it is middle grade friendly. So if your 11-year-old who's a really good reader picked it up, you wouldn't have to stop them from reading it. So it is no Sarah J. Maas. It is not at all spicy, none of that kind of stuff. It is just pure adventure and camaraderie and common goals and all that. So that one, the characters are extremely close to my heart. And I think that everybody who has ever read it has told me that they fall in love with whichever character aligns with them. Everybody finds a character that works for them in that series. And then I also write horror. I have written mostly horror short stories at this point. I am part of the Autumn Tales group that writes a charity anthology every fall that raises money for Collective Liberty, which fights child sex trafficking. So the Autumn Tales series, and there are 3 of them now, Autumn Tales 1, 2, and 3, which is published by Anatolian Press. The authors who have contributed to those never take a penny for that. All of that money goes straight to Collective Liberty. And to date, I think we've donated somewhere in the neighborhood of $650 from online sales to Collective Liberty, which is very cool.
Great cause.
And that's been a lot of fun. So I have done some really fun horror. I already know the story that I'm going to write for next year. I've already kind of planned it out in my head. Betsy and I actually co-authored the one from this past year called Karen's in the Woods, which was very much inspired by our trip to Blue Ridge, Georgia. So
when you say Karen's, I'm assuming you're talking about like stacks, right? Not like, because you hear Karen's in the woods and you almost think about like a bunch of ladies yelling at people.
That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a bunch of, women, yes.
I thought you were talking about the Sasquatch stacks, because those are also called Karen's.
No. This is it's kind of a double entendre, right? It was intentionally, and also a play on Cabin in the Woods, right? Because it's a horror story. So, but it was, intended to be, it's these 2 women who are friends from college who are very much sort of think they're these tough, badass women who really have no business being out in the woods by themselves.
Hey, you Sasquatch, you need to get your ass out of here, because this is not the place for Sasquatching.
Right. And that one is a horror comedy. It is intended to be as much comedy as it is horror. So And that one was fun to write.
That one sounds really, really interesting. Like I want to check that one out just because I want to see where you guys kind of went with that one.
It's in Autumn Tales 3, and it was highly entertaining.
Hold on tight, guys. This is our last commercial break, but if you have some free time, don't forget to check out the awesome friends of the show, IKNOWSQUATCH, Snarly Out Natural Products, Cryptoteeology, and Big Ape Threads, and our other friends with affiliate links, Dimension Devices, Oregon-ite, and Sticker Mule, with additional discounts and credits available down in the show notes. And we are back, so let's hop right in. And I always like to continue on later with words of wisdom. So if there is any words of wisdom you could bestow on the listeners, what might it be?
Well, I would say that I would encourage everyone to remember that you are magical and you should embrace that magic every day because it makes life so much more interesting. I write several blogs about that kind of thing on my website, which I forgot to mention earlier. Sorry, www.jbcaine.com. But yeah, remember that you are magic. Every single person is magic, because if you weren't, there would be someone else just like you, and no one else has your magic. Your magic is unique in the universe.
Hey, like I always tend to say on the other show, you got to stay bizarre. Don't be worried about what other people are doing. Be your true, authentic self, and never be afraid
Absolutely.
to stay bizarre.
100%.
And if anybody, you kind of mentioned your website a little bit for your blogs and everything, but if anybody wanted to come and check out your podcast, they want to get a hold of you for any reason whatsoever, they maybe want to be a guest on your podcast or something.
Sure.
Where can people find you across the internet besides your books?
Okay, so as I said, it's jbcaine.com is my author website. We also have the UFB, unfreaking believable, ufbpodcast.com is where you can find all of the links to various listening platforms. We are on Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, and Audible. And you can also email us through that website at ufbpodcast@gmail.com if you have a story that you would like to share, and we would be happy to talk to you about it. And we put out episodes twice a month. So on the 11th and 27th of every month, we have new episodes. So always looking for new people.
And I, of course, will include those links down in the show description so everybody can find them quick and easy. And everybody make sure you go and check out their podcast. And if you guys have a story to tell, make sure you guys get a hold of them and share your story on the podcast to hopefully inspire some other people. And
Absolutely.
I really appreciate you making the time to come on today. Glad you ended up getting in contact with me. Glad that Betsy ended up connecting us. And it's been a wonderful conversation, and I'm really looking forward to next time.
Awesome. Thanks, Shayn. I appreciate you having me on.
If anyone would like to get a hold of me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can do so through email me at inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or through social media. Instagram or Facebook are the ones that I'm the most active on. Or you guys can get a hold of me through the submission forms, which are available on the Linktree. The first one of which is to contact me, and the second one is to report an encounter. So while you're at it, don't forget to report those encounters to ommencounterreports@outlook.com. Or you guys can call into the hotline, and that number again is 313-364-1551. Every single thing that I mentioned is all available on the Linktree, which is available down in the show description. And with that, hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. I hope today's show has connected some dots in your own reality, and I'll catch you on the next one. Have a good night, everybody.
Reality isn't what it seems. Abductees taking aboard a craft with a tractor beam. Is life a simulation or an astral dream? Aliens travel through black holes in different galaxies. Life is a bizarre odyssey, with a mic talking about philosophy. Well, Bigfoot is stalking campers as a Wendigo walks through the woods of sharpened antlers, using a Ouija board to talk to the dead like a necromancer. There's so many questions and not enough answers. So if you're interested in mysteries and abnormalities, tune in and listen to Inquiries of Our Reality. So if you're interested